Hello, students. This is Professor McDermott. Having explored nationalism in the last module, it's natural that we would move on to the topic of imperialism, because imperialism was an outgrowth of nationalism. Essentially, imperialism happened when nation states from Europe, decided to make their nations even stronger by building empires, collections of far-flung colonies throughout the world, but primarily during the 19th century in Africa and Asia. But first, before we get deeper into that topic, I want to mention an important event in the mid 19th century, the Crimean War. How did this come about? The Crimean War from 1853 to 1856. Well, the Ottoman Empire, the great Muslim power of Europe, still existed, and it was still an important power centered on the nation that is now called Turkey. But it was falling on hard times in the 19th century. If you look at the map, we'll come back to that slide in a moment, but if you look at this map, you see that all the areas in green, purple, and orange belonged to the Ottoman Empire as of 1800. But you see how those areas in purple had already fallen away before 1877, including Greece, part of Serbia, and Romania, which split off from the Ottomans after nationalist revolutions in the 1800s. And you see that even more territory would be lost after the Crimean War up to the outbreak of World War II. And so the Ottoman Empire looked like it was really on the verge of collapse. It was having difficulty controlling its territories. And so people began calling the Ottomans the sick man of Europe and expecting the demise or disappearance of the Ottoman Empire at any day. And of course, other nations sought to capitalize on the death of the Ottoman Empire that they expected, especially Russia. Russia had a lot to gain if it could pick up some of the territories that they expected the Ottomans to lose. Especially a seaport on the Mediterranean was something that they really wanted. Also, they wanted to increase their influence in the Balkans region. Looking at the map again, the Balkans are basically southeastern Europe. You see on the map Greece, Albania, Montenegro, Serbia, Bulgaria, Bosnia. This region we call the Balkans, and it's peopled by Slavic ethnic groups. And the Russians are also Slavs, and they saw themselves as the natural protector of these Slavic cousins, if you will, in the Balkans. So they really wanted to expand in that direction. And in 1853 did begin to expand into the Balkans, starting a war with Russia. Now, since Russia was a Christian country, and the Ottoman Empire was a Muslim country, you might expect the Christian rulers of Britain and France to go to war on the Russian side. But that is not what happened at all in 1853. Russia's saber rattling made Britain and France very nervous, and they wanted to really nip its imperial ambitions in the bud. And so they actually went to war on the side of the Ottomans to try to stop the Russians from expanding their empire. And the main focus of this war was a region called the Crimea, here on the map again. If you look at the Black Sea north of Turkey, you see sticking out from the north shore of the Black Sea, a peninsula has a major city on it called Sevastopol. That peninsula is the Crimea. And it was the Russian fortress or stronghold from which they were launching all their military operations against the Ottomans. And so the French and British attacked it, and over time captured Sevastopol, leading to the end of the Crimean War. But if all this sounds at all familiar, It should. Uh, because not so very long ago, the Russian leader Vladimir Putin invaded this peninsula, the Crimea, and recaptured it for Russia in an incident that caused a great deal of international controversy. And just as the British and French were worried in the 1850s about Russian ambitions, so many of our own leaders and other world leaders are very worried now about Putin and Russian ambitions again. So perhaps Karl Marx was right, and history does repeat itself. The first time is tragedy, the second is farce, if you remember that quote. All right. Russia lost this war. Um, it was a destructive and bloody war, partly because the Crimean War was the first war in which rifles um, were deployed extensively. And before rifles, soldiers shot with old fashioned muskets, which were really very inaccurate. And I mentioned this in the Napoleon lecture, but with the rifles now in the Crimean War, and later to an even greater extent in the US Civil War, rifles have a groove in the barrel that guides the bullet out in a perfect spiral, kind of like a quarterback throwing a pass, and it's much more accurate at much longer distance. And so it makes it easier for defenders to stop an attack, and it makes it much harder to attack successfully. So campaigns tended to become much longer and bloodier in the Crimean War, in the U.S. Civil War, and as we'll see in the next lecture, in World War One, when the advantage was almost totally to the defending side in a battle. But actually, most of the casualties, though, in the Crimean War were not caused by guns. They were caused by disease and the horrific sanitary conditions in the camps of all the armies on the Crimea. And this led to a very, very important development in modern medical history, because there was a British woman named Florence Nightingale who was reading the reports about the Crimean War and decided to go and see for herself what medical conditions were like in the British encampments. So she set out for the Crimea, and she got there and was absolutely horrified by the rapid spread of disease and the very primitive sanitation. And so she went to work as a nurse, and she convinced a number of other women to come to the Crimea and got government support for them to act as medical personnel during the Crimean War. And that was really a big change in policy, because previously all nurses had actually been men, and it makes sense if you think about the ideas about gender from the time. People thought first that women were too delicate and too sensitive to work in a, helping out with surgery, or seeing all of this blood, especially in a military environment. And second, of course, they thought it was immodest or indecent for women to see men undressed, as inevitably you do if you're a nurse. And so really, Florence Nightingale broke the mold and actually created the modern profession of nursing through her very brave intervention in this Crimean War. Well, Russia's lousy showing in this war did have one good effect for the poorest group of Russians. The Tsar, Alexander II, was convinced that Russia had lost the war because she was too backward and needed to modernize and become more like Western Europe. And so in 1861, he took a step in that direction by actually freeing or emancipating all the serfs, so that they would no longer be tied to the land as they had been for centuries in Russia. Well, we talked about how Otto von Bismarck managed to co-opt and use the issue of nationalism to help him reach his conservative goal of building up a very powerful, united German empire. And it's interesting, when you look at nationalism and imperialism together, you see that one of the reasons why why these tendencies really swept Europe in the 19th century was that many different people of different political persuasions could unite in support of nationalism and imperialism. Liberals, conservatives, they all had reasons to support imperialism. And what were the reasons? Well, for conservatives, the reasons were obvious, and the idea of white supremacy and social Darwinism that we'll talk about a little bit later, and also the desire to build up their own national states, build up their militaries to get them more into fighting, good fighting trim, by taking over colonies. But liberals too also supported imperialism because they saw imperialism as a way to eliminate customs from countries in Africa and Asia that they thought were really backwards and barbaric. One example, of course, is slavery. And the British had turned against slavery, even though they were once the great slave traders of Europe, freed their own slaves, all of their slaves as of 1833, and then became the main force that was policing Africa to try to stop the slave trade. And so the British public really was interested in stopping slavery everywhere. And so British leaders convinced the public that if the British could take over more and more of Africa, that would be a good thing because it would help stop the slave trade, and liberals could really get behind that. Also, in India, there was a custom known as sati, which was widely practiced among Hindus in India. And what this meant, when a man died, his wife, his widow, was expected to burn herself to death so that she could go to the grave with him. And this was very common. There was a great deal of debate within India, within the British Empire in general, about sati and whether it should be banned. But obviously, most of the British people thought that it should be banned. And so the campaign to eradicate this custom from India was another factor that got liberals on board with imperialism in Great Britain. Um, the mastermind of British imperial expansion in the late 19th century was Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli, a conservative party member. He was a fascinating man. He was a brilliant man, real genius in many ways. He wrote several novels, which are really good, actually. And he was the only British Prime Minister ever to be ethnically Jewish. So he overcame a lot of obstacles and prejudice to become the conservative Prime Minister of Great Britain. But it was really Disraeli who promoted imperialism very successfully in the British Empire in the late 1800s. Under Disraeli, the British, you could say, developed an attitude known as jingoism. And that term comes from a song that was popular in England in 1876, and it had to do with another conflict with Russia. A lot of people wanted to go to war with Russia again in 1876. And this song came out with the lyrics, quote, "We don't want to fight, but by jingo, if we do, we've got the men, we've got the ships, we've got the money too." So jingoism is just another name for a kind of proud, cocky, arrogant attitude on the part of a country. You know, you don't want to mess with us because we're going to take you apart. That's jingoism. And obviously went hand in hand with imperialism. And one other thing about imperialism in Britain, which was largely a democracy by this point, imperialism was very popular with ordinary British people. Even the poorest British people could take pride in the fact that they belonged to the greatest empire in the world. And poor people liked to read newspapers. That was the main form of entertainment. They only cost a penny. And so newspapers learned very quickly that stories about colonies and imperial wars and so forth really sold big among ordinary British citizens. And so newspapers also became a major force, whipping up imperialism in Britain and elsewhere in Europe and in America too, as we'll see. Um, well, in both Germany and France, you also see a move toward imperialism and trying to get territories in Africa and Asia. In Germany, because they had just managed to unite their nation and they thought that having an empire would secure their national existence. In France, because they were really humiliated at having been defeated by the Germans in the Franco Prussian War of 1870. And so for them, getting colonies was a way to kind of save face and improve their image, which had been tarnished by that war. I want to talk about a figure from Great Britain who kind of epitomizes the way that very noble, idealistic reasons for colonization could go hand in hand with more self centered impulses. And that man is David Livingstone, who was a Christian missionary from Scotland who became famous for his activities in Africa. Livingstone believed that if you were going to convert Africans to Christianity, that it was necessary not only to have a religious focus, but also a focus on exploration, scientific discovery, and business, commerce. He thought those three things went hand in hand. And so his program, his missionary program to try to convert Africans to Christianity involved three things: Christianity, commerce, and civilization. And so missionaries like Livingstone really believed in working hand in hand with business interests to open up Africa. Um, and they basically thought that even though Africans might suffer in the short term, perhaps being exploited by businesses, that the presence of missionaries would help remove that suffering, and it would prove to be a great benefit for the African people in the long run. Um, it's interesting. This Livingstone was involved in one of the most famous episodes of the 19th century with respect to imperialism. So he was working in southeastern Africa near Lake Tanganyika, and a few years went by, and by 1871, nobody had heard from Livingstone at all for 4 years, and there began to be a kind of outcry in the newspapers. Where is Livingstone? What has happened to Livingstone? And this was true even in the United States, when one of the great newspapers, the New York Herald, decided to send a young reporter named Henry Morton Stanley, who was originally from Wales but had emigrated to the U.S. and become kind of a cub reporter there in New York. They sent Stanley to go find Livingstone. Now, Livingstone, of course, didn't know he was lost. He was just doing what he did, which was working with Africans in that region. But in the eyes of the world, he was lost. He had to be found. And so Stanley went in search of Livingstone, and he hunted around Southeast Africa until finally, near Lake Tanganyika, he came upon a village where he saw a bunch of African people surrounding an old white guy with a long white beard wearing English clothes. And so Stanley went up to him and tipped his hat, and he said this famous quote, "Dr. Livingstone, I presume," with one of the most famous lines of the 19th century. So, of course, it was Livingstone. Who else could it be? So Stanley really became famous for finding Livingstone, and he wrote a book about it, of course, cashing in on his celebrity, called How I Found Livingstone. Florence Nightingale read the book, and she said it was the very worst book on the very best subject I ever saw in my life, suggesting perhaps that even though Livingstone was a good man and a very good subject for a book, she was a little bit suspicious of Stanley and his motives. And, well, she should have been. Because Stanley proved himself to be very opportunistic and very willing to exploit Africans in order to keep his newfound celebrity. He went back to Africa in 1874 for a 3 year expedition in which he was accused of being very cruel to the Africans who joined him on this trip. And then in 1879, the King of Belgium, Leopold II, had heard about Stanley, and he had a project to basically take over the region around the Congo River in West Central Africa uh, so that he could exploit it for his own business purposes. And so he hired Stanley to go to the Congo River, to go up and down the river and talk to the native rulers and to try to get them to sign treaties that would allow Leopold to come in with his business corporation and get rich off of the Congo, its natural resources, and by exploiting the labor of the African people there. And somehow Stanley managed to convince the native leaders to allow Leopold to do this. And so the Congo, essentially, it didn't belong to Belgium yet. It actually became more or less a personal possession of the king of Belgium through this business corporation. It became known as the Congo Free State, recognized as such by the Congress of Berlin in the mid 1880s. But in reality, it was a money making scheme by King Leopold of Belgium. And over time, the Congo Free State became synonymous with horror and exploitation and every kind of violence that you can imagine. Joseph Conrad, great English-speaking novelist, wrote his very, very wonderful book *Heart of Darkness* about life in the Congo Free State. Another person who recorded the atrocities in the Congo inflicted by the Belgians was a Baptist missionary from Great Britain. Her name was Alice Seeley Harris. And while she was in the Congo as a missionary, she began taking pictures of the native people there and showing how they were being mistreated. If you look at the picture on the right, you see that these two men are being treated like slaves. This is because they've been convicted, according to Leopold's justice, of some crime. And so you see that they're wearing shackles and chains around their neck. They've clearly lost their freedom. On the left, you see something even more shocking. The two boys in this picture obviously have both lost their right hands. How did that happen? Well, one of them had been tied up by some exploiter who's working for a business corporation in the Congo Free State, who had absolute control over the natives who worked for them. And someone has tied his hands too tightly and cut off circulation so that his hand had to be amputated. The other boy, however, underwent something that's even harder to understand, but we can learn about it if we look at this quote from a British government report of 1904, written by the diplomat Roger Casement. Casement reported that each time the corporal, that is, a military commando who's working for this company, goes out to get rubber, cartridges, bullets, are given to him. He must bring back all not used, and for every one used, he must bring back a right hand. In 6 months, they had used 6,000 cartridges, which means that 6,000 people are killed or mutilated. End quote. So you see what's happening here. The soldiers who are guarding these African workers are given bullets, and they're told that if you use a bullet, you better kill somebody with it. Okay, and so for every bullet we issue you, you're going to have to bring back the severed hand of somebody to show that you killed him with that bullet, because bullets are expensive. All right. So the little boy in the picture lost his hand because one of these military people used a bullet, and so he had to cut off a hand to bring back to show that he had killed somebody with that bullet. He hadn't wasted it. Well, it was atrocities like these that finally led the Belgian government to officially take over the Congo Free State, and to start cleaning it up in 1908, but not before it had become really a byword for evil throughout the world. It wasn't only the Belgians, of course, who were involved in this scramble for Africa, trying to get as much African territory under their belts as possible. The French and the British were very involved. The French got a foothold in Egypt in 1869 when they dug a canal from the Red Sea through to the Mediterranean Sea called the Suez Canal. This canal had been financed by British moneylenders, and after several years, the British actually took over the Suez Canal zone in Egypt and kept it as a territory of theirs for many years. But here you see the results of the scramble for Africa. About 90% of the land mass of Africa was taken over by European colonial powers, and you see the breakdown of who had what there in the key at the bottom left of the map. There were only two countries in Africa that were not colonized, that were not taken over. One of them was the ancient empire of Ethiopia in East Central Africa. The other, on the west coast of Africa, also in gray, Liberia, which has a very interesting history. Liberia was founded by ex-slaves from the United States of America who were shipped over to Liberia by a group called the American Colonization Society beginning in 1816. So these were, these were African American slaves who were set free and sent over to colonize this country of Liberia. And even today, people in Liberia speak English. They have American names, and it's very, very, very interesting element of American and African history, the creation of Liberia. Well, there were several reasons why European powers wanted to get into the colonization business. One of them was obviously economic. Colonies were a great source of raw materials, cheap raw materials that could be turned into manufactured goods. They also provided a great market for manufactured goods made in the mother country. So the British could sell their textiles to all their colonists throughout the world. It was like having a captive audience. Another reason was simply imperial rivalry. We see an example of this with Afghanistan in 1880. Now, Afghanistan was between India and Russia, and the British held India. They didn't really want Afghanistan, but they believed that the Russians were about to take Afghanistan, and so in 1880 they moved into Afghanistan and took it over for themselves, solely to keep the Russians from getting it and threatening India. And that problem of Afghanistan that started in 1880, of course, has now been handed on to the United States to deal with. So you see that the issues created by colonialism and imperialism are still very much live issues in the present day world, and we're still dealing with the aftermath of imperialism. Another very important reason for Europeans to get in colonization was the popularity of theories based on Charles Darwin's idea of evolution. Now, of course, Darwin taught that human beings had evolved from lower forms of life based on a process which he called natural selection, in which organisms that were better adapted to their environments were more likely to survive, and other organisms that were less well adapted were going to die out. And so this process is marked by what's called the survival of the fittest. Okay, that the fittest species and the fittest individuals of each species will survive, the others will die out, and evolution over time will favor qualities that help people to survive in their environment. Well, it wasn't Darwin himself, but followers of Darwin who began to apply his ideas to society and to argue that the same process was going on among human societies, that there was a great competition by the different nations and peoples of the world for scarce resources, and that only the strong would survive and the weak would die out. So these social Darwinists believed that it was important for each nation to become as strong and as large as possible, to give it a better chance to survive in this ongoing evolutionary struggle of different races and peoples. And of course, um, the British, the Germans, the French all believed that white Europeans were superior to non white peoples, Africans, Asians, Native Americans. They believed that the white race was the master race, that it was the strongest race, the super race, um, and that its destiny was to rule the world in a sense. And so, in keeping with social Darwinist ideas, they wanted to fulfill that destiny through expansion. One British author who very much promoted imperialism through his writing was the famous Rudyard Kipling. Now, you may be familiar with Kipling as a writer of children's books. He wrote the Jungle Book, that there have been some movies made of. But he also promoted imperialism through poems like The White Man's Burden, which came out in 1899 in an American magazine. I won't go into great detail about this poem because Group 2, this is one of your reading assignments for this module, so I'll let you guys explore it in more detail. Um, but here's a little snippet of it. The White Man's Burden. Take up the white man's burden, send forth the best ye breed. Go bind your sons to exile to serve your captives' need. To wait in heavy harness on fluttered folk and wild, your new caught sullen peoples, half devil and half child. Well, you may need a dictionary for some of this in this old fashioned language, but what is he saying here? That European colonizers are sending out their sons, the best of their sons, to serve their captives, to wait on the Africans, these wild people as he calls them, half devil and half child, to wait on Africans, to wait on Asians. You can see here that Kipling believes that colonization is not only a right for the white race, but it's actually a duty. It's something that white people, white Anglo-Saxons, are called to do because he believes that they will help non-white peoples. They will bring them modern government. They will bring them better laws. They will bring them modern medicine and scientific discoveries and so on. And that's why this last line here, he says the goal of imperialism is, quote, to seek another's profit and to work another's gain, end quote. So imperialists really believed that they were benefiting not only themselves and their own nations, but that what they were doing was really benefiting the people they were taking over. It was bringing them the superior civilization of the superior race and helping them to have a better life. Sometimes this was expressed in slightly ridiculous ways. On the right, you see an ad from a magazine for a soap company, British soap company, Pierce Soap, which still exists, by the way. And you see that the man in the picture is Commodore Dewey, who we'll meet in just a minute, an American admiral who's washing his hands with Pierce soap. And the caption may be a little hard to read, but it says, "The first step towards lightening the white man's burden is through teaching the virtues of cleanliness. Pierce soap is a potent factor in brightening the dark corners of the earth." And so literally European civilization is going to spread to these dark corners of the earth and make these dark people a little lighter. And commerce and business corporations like Pierce Soap are going to help with that process. So, see how all these motives really went hand in hand to promote colonization. But it's interesting, Kipling wrote The White Man's Burden as an attempt to convince the United States to get involved in imperialism. Because up to that point, up to 1898, when the Spanish American War broke out, our country had had very little interest in fighting wars overseas and getting territories um, off outside of North America. We really hadn't. We had had a very isolationist viewpoint ever since the presidency of George Washington. That we just minded our own business, kept to ourselves, took care of our own people, and didn't meddle with international affairs too much. And so Kipling was trying to encourage America to take what he saw as their rightful place in world affairs. After all, they were white Anglo Saxons, he believed, or most of them were, he believed. And so it was natural that they, like their British mother country, would take up the white man's burden and take on this duty of colonization. Um, so, what had happened the previous year? Um, Spain still had a few colonies in different places in the world. One of them was Cuba. The Cubans were revolting against the Spanish Empire, trying to get their independence. The United States President William McKinley decided to send a U.S. Navy ship, the Maine, down to Havana, Cuba, to keep an eye on what was going on there. And one morning in February 1898, the battleship Maine, blew up mysteriously. We still don't know what caused the explosion, but newspapers at the time, you see the political cartoon on the right, stirred up the public to believe that the Maine had been blown up by the Spanish government, and that therefore it was our duty to get involved in this war on the side of the Cuban revolutionaries and to fight against Spain. And the slogan you see on the flag there that Uncle Sam is holding, remember the Maine, and then there was another part that's not shown here, remember the Maine and to hell with Spain. That was the slogan on the lips of the American people in the summer of 1898. By the way, this kind of newspaper reporting we call yellow journalism, biased and trying to whip up the public into a frenzy to support their agenda so that they can sell more newspapers. Well, after this media frenzy, the United States did declare war on Spain. And the first action of the war was carried out by Commodore Dewey that you just saw in the ad. He led the U.S. Navy fleet in the Pacific into Manila Bay in the Philippine Islands, which were also owned by Spain, and defeated some Spanish ships there and basically took over the whole Philippines for the United States of America. And there were a few battles in Cuba. Theodore Roosevelt was the great hero of this war. And in a letter to Theodore Roosevelt by the Secretary of State, John Hay, Hay called this a splendid little war. We won it in just a few months in the summer of 1898. It was a smashing victory. It elevated us into being a player on the world stage, and also it made us an imperial power for the first time. Because out of the Spanish-American War, we got control of the Philippines, we got the island of Puerto Rico, and we got Guam in the South Pacific. We didn't take over Cuba, but we did keep a military base on the island of Cuba called Guantanamo Bay, which, if you follow the news, you know that is still owned by the United States. It's where we put people that we suspect of being terrorists. And you see on this map the extent of U.S. imperialism, mostly different islands in the West Indies and in the Pacific Ocean. Some of them we no longer own, some we do. Puerto Rico and Guam, for example, are still territories of the United States, and the citizens there are U.S. nationals. They're not U.S. Citizens. So in a way, they are still colonial possessions of the U.S. The Philippines proved to be the place where we had the most problems among our new colonies. Because when Dewey sailed into Manila Bay, the Filipino people came out and welcomed him with open arms because they believed that our troops were there to help them win their revolution and to get independence from Spain. So they saw us as liberators. But after a while, it became very clear that the United States had no intention of leaving the Philippines, that in fact we were taking over political control of those islands. And the President, McKinley, explained this change in policy. He said that he had prayed one night, all night long, in the White House, asking God to help him know what to do about the Philippines. And finally, he became convinced God was telling him that, quote, there was nothing left for us to do but to take them all and to educate the Filipinos and uplift and civilize and Christianize them, end quote. Well, you see the white man's burden in action there. This idea that it was the duty of the American people as a white Christian civilization to educate and uplift and civilize non-white, non-Christian peoples. But there's a catch to that. If you know any Filipinos, you know that actually many Filipinos were already Christians. They were Roman Catholics. After all, Spain had been there for hundreds of years, converting them to Catholicism. So why would President McKinley say we had to Christianize the Philippines? Well, it shows the attitude of the time among many Protestants that the Catholic Church was not a real Christian church, left over from that mutual hostility from the Reformation times. Well, when the Filipinos realized we were not leaving, they fought back, and there was a very bloody revolt against us now as a colonizing imperial power that lasted for 3 years and required our government to send more than 100,000 troops to suppress the revolt. This was a very ugly fight, but eventually, by 1902, we had quelled the resistance and established firm control over the Philippine Islands, which we kept until the year 1946, right after World War II, when we decided to set an example for other nations by allowing the Philippines to become independent. And that did prove a spark for decolonization by imperial powers, which we'll talk about in a future lecture.